Phase 1. The Arrival. Colonel Vance Sterling snatched Sloane Callahan's personnel file and hurled it directly into her face. Papers exploded across the grinder like white shrapnel. Every candidate froze in their tracks.
"Pick it up." His voice was forged from iron. "Every single page. On your knees."
Sloane didn't flinch.
"I said on your knees, Sergeant."
She looked at him not with defiance, not with fear, but with something far more dangerous than either. Complete, unnerving stillness. Sterling leaned in until his face was inches from hers, dropping his voice to a whisper only she could hear. "I will break you before this training cycle is over. That is a promise."
He had no idea that this promise would eventually cost him everything he believed.
If this story moves you, subscribe, hit the bell, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this shot travels. She arrived on an ordinary morning, the kind of day that felt entirely too mundane for what was about to unfold. Such mornings were meant for grocery lists, dentist appointments, and conference calls that could have been emails. They were not the kind of days a person showed up to one of the most demanding military sniper programs in the history of the United States Armed Forces. But Sergeant First Class Sloane Callahan had never lived her life on the world schedule. She stepped off the transport vehicle at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado with a single duffel bag, a battered rifle case she'd carried since Afghanistan, and the kind of quiet that made people inherently nervous. It wasn't the quiet of someone who had nothing to say. It was the heavy quiet of someone who had already decided most conversations weren't worth having. She was a mature woman, 5 feet 7 inches, 142 pounds of lean muscle and scar tissue, and possessed something much harder than either of those physical traits. It was something that lived deep behind her eyes, an intangible force that didn't have a proper name in any military manual ever written. The other candidates were already assembled on the grinder when she approached. 23 men, every single one of them an elite Ranger Recon Marine or Special Forces veteran. These were soldiers hand-picked from the top percentile of the top percentile men who had survived nightmares that would have broken ordinary people. And every single one of them looked at Sloane Callahan the exact same way. Not with outright hostility, but with confusion. The specific kind of confusion that brews just before a judgment is formed. A broad-shouldered, square-jawed Sergeant First Class named Gideon Thorne, the kind of soldier who made recruitment posters look realistic, leaned over to the man beside him. "Command really doing this?" he murmured, just loud enough to carry. The man beside him, a ranger named Navarro, didn't answer, but he didn't disagree either. Sloane heard it. She always heard things. Her father had taught her as a young girl that hearing wasn't about volume, it was about attention. Crouched in a deer blind in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, she had learned that silence was never the absence of information. Silence was the purest form of it. She set her duffel down and stood at attention. She did not introduce herself. She did not smile. She did not scan the crowd for allies. She simply waited. Patience, her father had once told her, is not weakness wearing a polite face. Patience is the brutal discipline of letting the world reveal what it actually is, before you respond to what you think it is. Shortly after, Colonel Vance Sterling walked out of the building, and the ambient temperature of the entire grinder seemed to plummet. It wasn't theatrical. He didn't swagger or make a grand production of his entrance. He simply appeared, an older man with iron-gray hair shorn close to his skull, wearing a uniform pressed by someone who treated perfection as a religion. He walked the way veteran soldiers walk when they no longer need to try to intimidate people. The intimidation simply travels ahead of them. He stopped in front of the assembled class,
his eyes scanning the ranks. They moved from left to right, paused on a few faces, and then locked onto Sloane. They stayed there for a long moment. In the military, holding unbroken eye contact with someone you outrank by a massive margin is not just a look. It is a declaration of war.
Sloane met his gaze directly.
Long ago, she had made a quiet vow never to drop her eyes first. It wasn't out of pride. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. But because the exact moment you look away is the moment your adversary knows they have a lever they can pull.
Sterling broke the gaze first. But it wasn't the retreat of a man backing down. It was the subtle shift of a man who had just confirmed a suspicion he deeply resented. He began his opening address. The SEAL Advanced Sniper Course, he stated plainly, had a completion rate of 41%. He delivered the statistic without drama, dropping it like a weather forecast predicting rain. More than half the men standing on that grinder would fail. Some would quit. Some would be cut for performance. A few, and he paused here, letting the gravity of the words settle, would suffer career-ending injuries.
This program, Sterling's voice echoed, does not grade on a curve. It does not make accommodations. It does not care about your prior records, your commendations, or what your commanding officer wrote in the glowing recommendation that got you here.
He walked slowly along the front row.
The only thing this program cares about is whether, when everything is stripped away, you can do the one thing that matters. Can you wait? Can you think? And can you put a bullet exactly where it needs to go, under conditions actively trying to make that impossible?
He stopped squarely in front of Sloane.
Is that understood, Sergeant Callahan?
The way he articulated her name felt like a scalpel slice, rehearsed, precise, and layered with just enough venom to make it a question that wasn't really a question at all.
Yes, sir, Sloane replied. Her voice was flat, clean, and utterly devoid of color.
He held her gaze for another beat before turning back to the center of the formation.
Good. Because starting soon, I'm going to show every one of you exactly what impossible actually looks like.
He meant it for the class. But every one of those 23 men, and Sloane herself, knew he had said it specifically for her.
Part 2. The Quiet Room.
Later that evening, Sloane sat alone on the edge of her rack in the barracks, meticulously cleaning her rifle. It was a sacred ritual. Every component handled in the exact same sequence, every surface tended to with deliberate reverence. Her father had taught her that a sniper's relationship with their rifle was nothing like a carpenter's relationship with a hammer. A hammer is a tool, but at the extreme distances and precision a true sniper operates a rifle is a musical instrument.
You had to know its soul. You had to know how it behaved under blistering heat, biting cold, and heavy humidity. You had to know the microscopic variations in its trigger pull that shifted depending on how long you'd been holding your position.
Her father was Arthur Callahan, Staff Sergeant, United States Marine Corps, retired. He was a scout sniper with multiple tours in Vietnam and another in a shadow conflict the government never put on official records. In his final moments, sitting in his favorite chair by the farmhouse window in Montrose, Colorado, he had stared out at the mountains, just as he had done for decades. She had been holding his frail hand.
He wasn't a man of many words, but as his breathing grew shallow, he looked at her and whispered, "You already know everything I taught you. Now you just have to trust it." She had made him 3 promises that night, written in her own hand on a scrap of paper tucked into the inner pocket of his Bible, where it still lived. She cleaned the bolt assembly, now setting it carefully on the oiled cloth beside her.
Serve with honor. Never quit. Become the sniper they said you couldn't be.
She didn't need to read the list. She knew the words, the same way she knew her own pulse. She just kept cleaning.
The initial phase of training was designed with a singular, brutal purpose: to find the exact coordinate where a candidate's spirit shattered. There was no pretense of a gradual warm-up. They started at the absolute maximum threshold of human endurance and then relentlessly found ways to exceed it. Sleep deprivation layered over physical exhaustion, compounded by cognitive tests, followed by grueling field exercises that started before dawn and ended long after midnight. Instructors screamed contradictory orders to test reactions to pure chaos. Equipment checks in the dead of night, punishing runs immediately followed by precision shooting exercises that required a heart rate below 60 beats per minute. Most of the candidates had braced for a hardship they believed they could manage. But it wasn't the physical pain that broke people. It was the absolute relentlessness. There was no moment, not one, where the environment granted permission to exhale. A few days in, 2 men voluntarily withdrew. One went to the medical bay with a stress fracture. Another simply stopped walking during a brutal land navigation exercise, sat heavily on a rock, and refused to stand back up. The instructor surrounded him in utter silence until one eventually walked away to fetch the dropout paperwork. Sloane absorbed the attrition. She wasn't invincible. Claiming otherwise would be a lie. She carried an exhaustion that burrowed beneath her muscles, settling deep into her connective tissue and bones. She was shivering through the coastal mornings, surviving on vastly less sleep than her body demanded, and far more coffee than it required. But Sloane possessed a defense mechanism the others lacked. When the external world became utterly unendurable, she retreated inward. Her father had called it the quiet room, not a physical location, but a mental fortress. It was a space in the mind where the noise couldn't penetrate, provided you built the walls thick enough. He had built his quiet room in the dense, suffocating jungles of Vietnam, lying motionless while insects crawled across his face,
Waiting for a shot that sometimes never came. The body will do almost anything you ask it to do, he had told her when she was a child complaining about the biting cold during a late autumn hunt. The body is remarkably cooperative. It's the mind that surrenders first. So you build a room in your mind that quitting can't enter, and when things get bad, you go there.
She spent a lot of time in that room during the first phase. And from within that fortified silence, she noticed something the other candidates were too blinded by exhaustion to see. The pattern. Every instructor had a distinct rhythm to their applied pressure. Colonel Sterling had a pattern too. He was hardest on her not randomly, but with surgical precision in the exact moments she was performing flawlessly. Whenever she finished first in a grueling evolution, or solved a tactical problem faster than anyone else, his pressure didn't ease. It compounded. It was as if her sheer excellence was the primary defect he was trying to correct. She stored this observation quietly, filing it away with her father's lessons on reading the morning wind. In the following phase, she properly met Brody Lawson. He was a young man from a tiny town in eastern Tennessee, the kind of place with a made-up-sounding name that was actually more real than most bustling cities. Brody was a ranger, and mechanically, he was brilliant. His physical conditioning was flawless, and he possessed an innate grasp of fieldcraft. But Brody had a fatal flaw he disintegrated under observation. The second an instructor watched him, his mechanics fractured, his breathing hitched, his smooth trigger pull became a desperate, anxious jerk. His groupings widened disastrously. It was like watching a virtuoso pianist suddenly forget how to use his hands the moment an audience filled the room. Sloane recognized the affliction immediately. She'd fought the exact same demon as a young soldier. Her old instructor, a crusty master sergeant named McAfee, who perpetually smelled of diesel and chewing tobacco, had looked at her targets and sighed, "You shoot like someone who's terrified of being wrong." She found Brody alone on the range at dusk, running dry fire drills in the fading light. "Your breathing's wrong," she said. He jumped, startled that she had closed the distance without making a sound, a habit so deeply ingrained in her that she didn't even realize she was doing it.
Ma'am, when you know someone's watching you, try to control your breathing instead of letting it happen. You're fighting your own body. Your groups tell on you every time.
He stared at her, entirely unsure how to process this. A woman he had secretly doubted was dissecting his failure with surgical precision. "How do you know?"
"Because I did it for years before someone finally pointed it out," she said. "Was your father a hunter?"
Brody blinked.
"Yes, ma'am." "How did you know?" "Because you hold your breath right before the shot, exactly like deer hunters do. It's an instinct. It works for short range, but a sniper doesn't hold. A sniper finds the natural respiratory pause between the exhale and the inhale and fires inside that perfect quiet window. There's a massive difference between controlling your breath and fighting it."
Brody looked down at his rifle.
"Why are you telling me this?" It was a valid question. In a pipeline with a majority of candidates washed out, helping a peer survive technically worked against her own odds.
"Because that's not how I was raised," she said softly, leaving him alone to practice. The following session, his groupings tightened drastically. Chief Petty Officer Carver, his primary instructor, noticed the improvement immediately. He said nothing, but his eyes narrowed in silent calculation.
Word traveled through the barracks the way it always does in isolated, high-stress environments. Fast, quiet, and devastatingly accurate. As the phase concluded, the invisible dynamic of the class began to shift in imperceptible ways. Part 3. The immovable obstacles. The real sabotage began on a training day. It started with her scope. During an intense long-range movement exercise, Sloane fired a shot that struck high and left. At that extreme distance, it was a total miss. She made an adjustment, confirmed a hit, and moved on, but the adjustment didn't track properly. She adjusted again. The error persisted, but it was erratic. It wasn't the wind. Wind errors are consistent and predictable. This was random. A scope doesn't naturally develop a random mechanical error without interference. Someone had deliberately tampered with her optic. She finished the grueling evolution without letting a flicker of emotion cross her face, managing a passing score despite the crippled equipment.
But the icy certainty settling in her chest confirmed it wasn't an accident. That evening, she stripped the optic down to its bare components. Tucked invisibly between the elevation turret and the adjustment body was a hair-thin metal shim. It was so perfectly placed that a visual inspection would never catch it. You had to dismantle it completely to find it. She held the tiny piece of metal up to the harsh barracks light for a long while. Then she zipped it into a secure pocket of her kit, reassembled the rifle, re-zeroed it in the dark, and went to the mess hall. She told no one. Accusations without hard proof, in a command structure desperate for reasons to fail her, were simply weapons that fired backward. Her father had always warned her to hide her bleeding, because predators are magnetically drawn to the scent of blood. So she bled in complete privacy, and she waited. The blatant score manipulation happened in the next phase. She crushed the unknown distance stalking exercise, earning the highest raw performance score in the entire class. She had run the complex math in her head, a deeply ingrained habit. But when the official rankings were posted, her name sat at 7th. The methodology note appended to her grade cited, "Technique deviations. Subjective penalties applied to no one else." Gideon Thorne, who had finished the stalk far behind her and missed a target, was listed 3rd. Sloane stared at the board in deafening silence. Gideon walked up and stood shoulder to shoulder with her. He looked at the paper, then at her profile, his expression twisting into something deeply complicated. "That's not right," Gideon murmured. She didn't turn her head. I was behind you on the approach, he continued. I watched your stalk. It was flawless. Cleaner than mine. He swallowed hard. I'm not saying this because I pity you. I'm saying it because it's the truth of what I saw.
It was the most honest piece of dialogue she had experienced since arriving at Coronado.
I know, Sloane said.
What are you going to do?
She stared at the fabricated numbers. Keep shooting.
She filed a formal discrepancy notice through the chain of command. Not because she believed it would magically fix her score, but because she understood that documentation is a unique caliber of ammunition. A couple of days later, she was summoned to Colonel Sterling's office. It was a sterile, unforgiving room. He was standing with his back to her, staring at a blank wall, gathering his armor before turning around. Sergeant Callahan, you filed the discrepancy notice?
Yes, sir.
You are aware that I personally review all performance documentation.
Yes, sir.
Sterling sat down, lacing his fingers together. He deployed the specific expression he reserved for decisions he had already made before the conversation started. I've reviewed the scoring. The methodology was applied consistently. Experienced evaluators notice nuances that raw data misses. With respect, sir, Sloane kept her tone impeccably neutral. I'd like to know specifically what deviations were observed and whether they were documented in real time or magically generated after the composite score was calculated. A dangerous flicker crossed Sterling's eyes. It wasn't anger. It was something colder. Are you accusing me of something, Sergeant? She held his stare. No, sir. I am asking a procedural question regarding a score that affects my standing. The ensuing silence was suffocating. You are a long way from where you think you are, Sterling finally warned. It wasn't an overt threat, but it possessed the exact geometry of one. Yes, sir, she replied. I'm acutely aware of that.
She walked out into the cool evening air, inhaling the salt off the Pacific. She allowed herself a brief moment to feel the white-hot rage she had suppressed inside his office.
The bone-deep, crushing frustration of being undeniably the best, yet having to bleed just to be acknowledged as adequate. She allowed the feeling to exist for just a moment. Then she returned to the barracks and cleaned her rifle. Part 4. Ghost. Target 7. The discrepancy notice did not vanish. It festered in the system like a jagged splinter. And Sterling was not a man who tolerated splinters.
Days after their meeting, he called a full assembly before dawn. The air was frigid, the candidate's breath pluming in the darkness. Sterling paced the front of the formation, his voice slicing through the cold.
We have a candidate who has questioned the absolute integrity of this course's evaluation process. He didn't say Sloane's name. He didn't have to. Every eye violently flicked toward her before snapping back to attention.
In my long career of running sniper programs, I have never had a candidate insult this command's integrity. Do you know why? Because candidates who belong here know that this course owes you nothing but the brutal truth. And the truth is, some people standing on this grinder simply do not have what it takes. Paperwork won't save you.
He stopped directly in front of Sloane.
Are we clear, Sergeant Callahan?
Yes, sir.
She set her voice a placid, unbothered lake.
Sterling held the silence for a long, theatrical moment before walking away.
What he failed to see, because his back was already turned, was Gideon Thorne. Gideon looked at the retreating colonel and then at Sloane. The look on Thorne's face was no longer neutral. It was the face of a man who was watching an atrocity and realizing his silence made him complicit. The training evolved into the environmental integration block, the sublime art of reading the world and folding its invisible data into a ballistic trajectory. The primary instructor was Chief Petty Officer Adler, a quiet, hyper-methodical man who taught by asking probing questions rather than shouting answers. During a session overlooking a sweeping valley, Adler pointed to a target set at an extreme distance, far beyond the visual range of the standard wind flags.
What's the wind doing at the target? The men guessed, interpolating the flag data and extrapolating mathematical theories. Sloane remained silent, her eyes locked on something else entirely. A tiny falcon hovering motionless in the sky directly above the target zone. Adler noticed. Callahan, what are you watching?
The bird, Chief. Why the bird?
Because it's hovering at the exact target distance, and the micro-adjustments in its wings are telling me the truth about the wind. The flags are locked at ground level. The bird is reading the atmospheric current at chest height. It's leaning heavily into a crosswind the surface flags can't feel. The valley is funneling the air.
Adler stared at her.
What's your correction? She recited the precise mathematical adjustment. Adler gave a single, definitive nod. He turned to the men. Remember this. Wind flags are a suggestion. They are never the complete answer. That night, Brody Lawson sat quietly near Sloane's rack. How did you know to look for the bird? Sloane paused her cleaning rod. My dad used to say that animals are reading the environment long before we arrive, and they'll keep reading it long after we leave. They don't have the luxury of getting it wrong. If you want the truth, watch the things that depend on it for survival. Brody swallowed. Every guy in this class knows you're the best shooter here, especially the ones too cowardly to admit it. That's kind, Sloane said, but it doesn't solve the problem. The real problem culminated during the final crucible phase, the dual stress protocol. A brutal obstacle course immediately followed by a timed live-fire engagement. It was meant to break the mind and bodies simultaneously. Sloane soon discovered a specific modification just for her. During the physical run, she was routed into a deep mud pit section that none of the men had to cross. It cost her crucial minutes. She hit the firing line late, her heart threatening to shatter her ribs. She threw herself behind her optic and rapidly engaged the targets, but the clock expired just as the final steel plate rotated into view. She had been robbed of the time required to achieve a perfect score. In the subsequent interrogation panel, a lieutenant commander named Langdon asked her to defend her less-than-perfect run. My route was intentionally altered to include a mud hazard the standard route bypassed, she stated cleanly. It destroyed my transition time, Langdon scoffed.
That's a heavy accusation, Sergeant.
It's a topographical observation, she corrected. I memorized both route markers during the morning walkthrough. Langdon's pen stopped moving. The panel fell dead silent. The next morning, Gideon Thorne shattered the fragile piece of the barracks. He walked straight into the common area, holding up his smartphone for the room to see. It was a photograph he had secretly snapped during the walkthrough. It clearly showed the deliberately altered, sabotaged route markers. I thought it was an administrative mistake, Gideon announced to the silent room. Then the exercise happened. I figured some things out. He shoved the phone into his pocket. I'm taking this to Chief Carver. You can come with me, Callahan, or not, but I'm going. Without a word, Sokolov, a ranger who had barely spoken a sentence to Sloane the entire course, stood up. I'll go too. The confrontation with Carver was remarkably quiet. He looked at the photographic proof, his face darkening with the grim realization of command corruption. He took a photo of Gideon's screen, thanked the men, and dismissed them. That evening, Sloane stood once again in Sterling's office. The colonel looked fundamentally exhausted, carrying the heavy, invisible weight of a collapsing lie. The route variance has been classified as an administrative error, Sterling said softly, refusing to meet her eyes. Your score will be mathematically adjusted to reflect a flawless run. He looked at her, searching for triumph or gloating. He found neither. Is there anything you want to say? No, sir. Sloane walked out into the corridor, leaned her head back against the concrete wall, and closed her eyes for a brief span. She let the crushing weight of the injustice, the gaslighting, and the sheer exhaustion wash over her. Then she opened her eyes, locked her jaw, and walked away.
There was still a target waiting in the high desert of Nevada.
Part 5. The Echoes of the Canyon. The transport bus rolled out of Coronado in the pre-dawn hours. The remaining candidates, whittled down by the brutal attrition of the preceding period, sat in suffocating silence. Everyone knew what awaited them in the jagged canyons of Nevada Ghost Target 7. Upon arrival, Colonel Sterling stood at the precipice of a massive, sweeping canyon, addressing the surviving men. Ghost Target 7 has sat in this canyon for decades, Sterling projected over the howling wind. It is placed at the absolute bleeding edge of physical limitation and human skill. A target profile with zero margin for error, besieged by canyon crosswinds that actively defy standard ballistics. He paused, letting the wind punctuate his speech. In all these years, hundreds of elite candidates have attempted this shot. Every single one has failed. The wind environment here cannot be conquered. Physics simply dictates it. He locked his eyes onto Sloane. Physics says so. That evening, while the men rested, Sloane hiked alone to the high rim overlooking the Killing Valley. She sat on the cold stone and watched. She didn't calculate, she simply observed. She watched the dust devils form, watched the erratic sway of the hardy desert brush. After a long interval, she finally saw the truth. A hidden microscopic rotation in the lower canyon dust, a thermal pocket that cycled in a predictable rhythmic loop. It wasn't chaos. It was a breathing ecosystem. She timed the cycle in her head. It was a steady, unyielding rhythm. There was a fraction of a moment within that cycle where the impossible wind aligned perfectly with a bullet's trajectory. She walked back to camp under the starlight, possessing the key to an impossible lock. Chief Carver watched her return from the shadows, dragging on a cigarette, his eyes tracking her quiet confidence. Qualification day broke with a profound, heavy silence. 17 candidates lined up, 1 shot each. Shooter after shooter stepped to the line. And shooter after shooter, the canyon violently swatted their rounds away. Gideon Thorne sent a perfect, mathematically flawless shot downrange, only to watch it smash into the rocks far below the steel. Gideon stepped back, his face grim, and looked at Sloane. "The wind down there is lying." "I know," she whispered. "You figured it out." "I think so." Gideon stared at her, an unspoken reverence dawning in his eyes. "Then go kill it." When Sloane finally stepped to the line, Colonel Sterling's voice boomed across the desolate rock. "No one can make this shot. Not today, not ever. Physics says so." Sloane ignored him. She lowered herself behind her optic, and the chaotic screaming world went dead quiet. She built the walls of her quiet room. She didn't immediately stare through the glass. Instead, she looked out over the vast expanse of the canyon with her naked eyes, waiting, feeling, listening to the earth. Behind her, Chief Carver leaned into his spotting scope, his hands balling into tight fists. He realized what she was doing. She wasn't guessing. She was waiting for the hidden heartbeat of the valley. Sloane began counting the rhythm in her mind. Wait. Wait. The thermal pocket shifted. The air pressure dropped. The distant heat mirage suddenly flattened out into a perfect, glassy tunnel. She found the natural pause at the absolute bottom of her breath. She didn't fight her body. She surrendered to the stillness. She pulled the trigger. The rifle roared, the violent percussion echoing off the jagged canyon walls. The bullet vanished into the abyss, tearing through the air at supersonic speed. Nobody dared to breathe. Carver stared unblinking through his glass, counting the flight duration in his head. Just before the anticipated impact, clang! The distinct, glorious sound of shattered metal echoed back up the canyon. Clean, unmistakable. Dead center. Carver ripped his eye away from the scope, his face pale with sheer shock. Dead center, he breathed, his military composure shattering. Dead center. The firing line erupted. Brody Lawson let out a guttural, primal roar of disbelief. Sokolov cursed in holy reverence, and Gideon Thorne, the man who had doubted her on the very first day, turned his back to the wind, placed a hand over his mouth, and wept silently in the dirt. Sloane stood up from the rifle. She turned and locked eyes with Colonel Vance Sterling. The older man looked utterly devastated, his rigid worldview collapsing under the weight of a single supersonic truth. Later that evening, after the impossible had been cemented into official military history, Sterling approached Sloane in the quiet isolation of the barracks. He looked stripped of his rank, his armor, his arrogance. "My sister's name was Elise," Sterling confessed, his voice trembling. "She was brilliant. She tried to become the first woman through a special warfare pipeline. But the pressure, the invisible, suffocating pressure of being the only woman in a room full of men waiting for her to fail, broke her mind. She never recovered." Sloane stood entirely still, listening to a broken man bleed. "I spent decades believing that keeping women out of this program was protecting them," Sterling choked out. "I thought I was saving the next Elise. I was wrong. I spent this entire course trying to make you quit, and you didn't, because you had something inside you worth staying for." "So did Elise," Sloane replied, her voice impossibly gentle. Sterling's eyes filled with hot tears he refused to let fall. He handed her a sealed envelope. "This is a battlefield promotion, and a commendation for the highest score in the history of this program. Earned, not given." He saluted her, turned on his heel, and walked away, a fundamentally changed man. When Sloane was finally alone in her quarters, she pulled the battered photograph of her father from her breast pocket. She looked at the old scout sniper, at the young girl grinning behind an oversized rifle at the Colorado mountains, standing eternal in the background. She opened her weathered journal to the 3 promises she had written on the night he died. With a trembling hand, she placed a definitive check mark next to the final line. "Become the sniper they said you couldn't be." She sat in the quiet room of her mind, surrounded by the echoes of a shattered steel target, and she finally allowed herself to cry. She cried for her father. She cried for Elise. She cried for every woman who had ever been told by the world that they did not belong. Sloane Callahan didn't just break a record that day in the high desert. She shattered a ceiling made of iron and doubt. And the ringing echo of that single shot would travel forward through time, whispering a new, undeniable truth to anyone brave enough to listen.